from wherever you are watching this webinar. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm a former civil servant here in the UK, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this webinar today on behalf of the Publishing House Global Government Forum and our knowledge partner today, PA Consulting. Now, in terms of today's topic, the responsive government investigating the agility of the civil service in 9 countries, it's safe to say that few global events in recent history have created quite as much uncertainty for quite as long as COVID-19 has done. And governments and civil servants everywhere around the world have had to adapt at pace and divert huge resources in their response to this crisis. And against this backdrop, Global Government Forum and PA Consulting conducted a survey of more than 850 civil servants across 9 different countries to assess how they rated their own organisation's responsiveness, with the ultimate aim of identifying best practice as well as common areas for improvement that could help to shape country strategies in the future. Now, we have an excellent panel with us here today who are going to reflect on some of those key findings from the research, and I'll introduce them in a moment. But after our speakers have spoken, it's your opportunity, our audience, to put your questions to the panel. So please do, whatever device you're on, you should see there's a Q&A button, a Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. At any point during this webinar from now on, please send in your questions using that Q&A function. We'll get through as many of those questions as we can once we've heard from our speakers. So in terms of our panel today, first we will hear from Richard Johnstone, who is the Executive Editor of Global Government Forum, and he has worked in public policy journalism throughout his career. And Richard played a key role in the research and will be talking us through the approach and the findings, so setting the scene at the beginning. Then we'll hear from Alex Richards, who leads PA's international adaptive business with the public sector. And Alex has particular expertise on delivering complex technology-enabled and digital transformation at national and international level. And then I'm delighted to say we'll head over to Canada, where we'll hear from Paul Glover, who is the President of Shared Services Canada. Shared Services Canada is responsible for delivering, amongst other things, digital services to Government of Canada's organisations. Paul has worked across the Canadian public sector on a number of policy areas during his career. Most recently, before his previous role, he was the Associate Deputy Minister of Health Canada and then the President of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. He's also served on numerous governing bodies, including the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and has been a member of the National Academies of Science in the USA. So it's great to have Paul with us here today. And then last but not least, we'll head over to Norway, where we'll hear from Greta Kvernland Berg, who leads PA's public sector practice in Norway, and who's an expert in delivering digital transformation in the public healthcare sector. Greta leads Norway's hub for innovative healthcare service design, including transformation of mental health and other patient services. So I'm sure you'll agree with me, we have a really impressive panel here with us today. Please do take this opportunity to send in your questions to our panel, as I mentioned a few moments ago. But without further ado, I'm going to invite Richard to kick us off with his presentation. Over to you, Richard.
Hello, Siobhan, and hello, everybody, and everybody watching along. As Siobhan said in her introduction, this was indeed a very in-depth study of how public and civil servants across a host of countries view their own government organisations' responsiveness, the ability to adapt effectively to change. And I'm going to set out some of the top points and highlights from the research. So a quick note on methodology at the top. Global Government Forum and PA Consulting designed a self-assessment questionnaire for this project, and overall we received, I think the exact number is 873 responses to the questionnaire, including 133 from senior officials across 9 countries. Most of the countries, the respondents were the senior officials, but in the UK, US, Canada, New Zealand and Australia, there were also responses from the wider civil service. So where there is a distinction in the respondents to the results, I will mention it. So the research itself comprised of 54 statements plus one overarching declaration on responsiveness. Respondents were asked to rate the extent to which they agreed or disagreed with these statements, and then a 0 to 10 scale of agreement was calculated to rate responsiveness. So the results here are shown based on the average scores across the groupings on this 0 to 10 scale. The statements were designed for civil servants to be able to self-assess both their organisation's environment for change and ability to move at pace. It used 6 main drivers of responsiveness, which you can see on this first slide. Leadership, including vision, strategy and purpose, teamwork and collaboration, staff empowerment, autonomy and accountability, use of evidence, tools and resources, including staffing and human resources, and approaches and appetite to experimenting and considering new things. And we will share some what are called radar charts later, overlapping charts that show the results in different countries, and those are based on these categories, and from which the overall responsiveness score for each nation is calculated. There is then alongside that a confidence index, which is the score that the respondents gave from 0 to 10 in the overarching declaration, based on my organisation excels at learning and responding rapidly to meet evolving citizen and end user needs. So the starting point for the results is the response to that declaration, and that is the next slide, please. You will see here that the majority of public and civil servants think their organisations are indeed responsive. The average line there is around 7, just below, and you can see the different countries' response rates up against that. You will see that 3 countries rate themselves as above average: Sweden, New Zealand and Denmark, and we'll touch on each of those individually, but it is worth highlighting at the start, I think, the high level of belief in responsiveness across the nations that responded to the report. But the report did also find that bureaucratic systems in governments don't always make it easy to be a responsive organisation. Public servants in most of the countries identified room for improvement in areas including collaboration, communication of decisions through the ranks, empowerment of staff and giving permission to try and fail, and ensuring end user input in making policy. But the lowest scores for organisations related to their ability to move at pace. Respondents in most countries complained about being hamstrung by unnecessary bureaucracy. And if we move on to the third slide, we can see that reflected in the answers to questions around the specifics of government's response to uncertainty. This graph shows 3 things, and this is for the leaders who responded to the report. The black dot indicates how quickly governments can capitalise on opportunities arising from uncertainty. The blue dot on how the COVID response has helped develop capabilities that were not there previously, and the orange dot, how effective leaders think their governments are at adopting to significant change as part of their long-term strategy. Again, with this graph, it's worth noting that the baseline starts at 5, so these are all net positive scores. But you will see that for all countries, the ability to quickly capitalise on opportunities was the lowest of these scores. There's much more confidence in adopting to significant change when there is time to think about it, as per the orange dot, part of the long-term planning, than when it has to be done quickly, which can lead to things like resources, raising problems with the rate of response. The blue dot is also interesting in terms of respondents highlighting that COVID had helped them develop skills and capabilities in the organisations that were not there previously. The 3 of the 4 highest scoring organisations on the COVID response, New Zealand, 3 of the 4 highest scoring countries, on the COVID response. New Zealand, Sweden and Denmark were also the most confident overall, but you'll see there that the fourth highest ranking blue dot was the UK, and you can see the difference between its blue and black dots was the largest of any of the respondents, which I think indicates something about the confidence of UK civil servants that we can touch on later. So that's the overview of the research overall. We now take a look at some of the countries specifically and see if there are any lessons that we can draw from them. So next slide, please, which shows Sweden's response in an overlapping radar graphic. And Sweden stands out from the research as the world's most responsive government. So congratulations to the Swedes, and any Swedes on the call. Some of the highlights from these scores, and you can see the black map in the middle is the average, and the overlap is where Sweden exceeds it. 60% of leaders responding to the report agreed there was little unnecessary bureaucracy in their organisation. That was up high in the report, compared to just 12% of the same cohort in the UK, for example. So what's the story behind these high ratings? One hypothesis is that given consistently high ratings for Sweden in the World Happiness Report and things like that, it might just be that Swedish public servants are as satisfied with their life professionally as they are personally. But there could be other more managerial explanations. We quote in the report Danny Danwoodson Razinga, the Chief Customer Officer at Sweden's Customer Registration Office, who said the high scores are a result of a totally different management style. And he added, we have some trust in each other. They give you the what to do, but the how is up to you within a frame of course. But I also know that if I don't deliver what is expected, I don't have a job anymore. And again, you can see from that graph, empowerment and autonomy was another area where Sweden was very high in the charts, a reflection of this high trust culture. So that's definitely one of the things that comes from the Swedish results. Next in the rankings, if we go to the next slide, we have New Zealand. And as well as high overall scores, New Zealand gives us a nice insight into how a government has improved its responsiveness. The country scored highly in its responses to the question, we operate in an environment where people with a diverse range of skills and opinions are available at short notice to help problem solve, and was also the highest positive response to the question about the COVID having created new skills in the organisation. That is one thing that is highlighted in the report as well. We quote Janine Foster, the Director of Risk, Security and Assurance at the New Zealand Customs Service, who says, I would have to say that Customs has been more responsive to new demands than I could ever have imagined when thinking about the COVID response. If someone had said to us 2 years ago, do you think you'd be able to deal with this sort of change? No one would have said yes. But people now feel more confident, she said, to make a decision, even if they don't know everything. Actually, it turns out they don't need to. They can still make a good decision based on what they know now and change it later if needs be. So that's a really good insight, I think, into how New Zealand has empowered its staff, particularly in response to the COVID pandemic. We'll take a look at a couple more high-ranking countries, starting with Denmark. So next slide, please. Again, you'll see it has high overall marks for its responsiveness, but the Danes mark themselves out as global government's collaboration kings. The responses to the report, which again were all senior figures, were 100% in agreement that they work well together in teams to generate and implement solutions, and they were more confident than their peers in any other country about their efforts to collaborate outside their own teams too. The Danes were also the most positive of all leadership cohorts about being able to adapt to significant change as part of their organization's long-term strategy. And among the highlights in the report of how this has manifested itself was that it took Denmark just 3 months to build and implement a COVID-19 passport scheme. The next slide, we'll take a quick look at Canada, just to try and help the scene for Paul's comments. Canadian public servants consider themselves, as you'll see from this, above average in their ability to consider new things and experiment. That stood out. The leadership cohort in Canada's Wade Mean scores also put them among the top 3 of the surveyed countries for statements on leadership, staff empowerment, and risk appetite. And the overall Canadian cohort, which also included managers and frontline officials, as well as the leaders, was upbeat about their organisation's responses to COVID. And in the report, not to steal his thunder, hopefully, but we do get a quote from Paul where he says the sense of pride in public service is probably the highest it's ever been right now, and not just in one department, but right across the board. So hopefully we'll hear more on that shortly. So just to move on to perhaps some of the lessons from countries that had lower scores in the report. The next slide will be the first of these. And the lesson isn't so much from a country, it's more that size seems to matter. Leaders in the leaders responding to the report in nations with smaller populations and less complex parliamentary and governance systems tended to exhibit more confidence. The bottom 4 countries on this graph, which is the population of the respondents, were the top 4 countries in the report. So there seems to be something about the ability of smaller countries to get people together at short notice and, or indeed at longer notice, and solve problems, which bigger countries might try to learn from, whether that be systems around policymaking collaboration, local service delivery, or governance structures. But it definitely seems that the size of a nation and its governance structures that accompany that does matter. And the other lesson I would take from the laggards, as it were, is the next slide, which is, I would say that morale and how public and civil servants are treated also matters. These are the rankings for the UK. Again, you'll see from the radar chart, it had many of the lowest scores. Again, this was the radar chart for the leaders that responded to the report, but the UK civil servants that responded that were more rank and file also had the lower scores. The report speculates that the negative responses of UK civil servants reflects a very bruising period here in the UK over the last half decade or so following the Brexit vote, when many civil servants faced a lot of criticism from the press and politicians about their supposed inaction and disagreement with the Brexit vote. So it's been a very difficult time for UK civil servants. To be frank, we don't have the data to prove that that's the effect that it's had, but it's definitely worth noting that the UK's low overall score comes despite it viewing itself as having adapted well in the coronavirus pandemic. Remember, it was the 4th highest ranking country on the COVID response element in one of the earlier slides. So it definitely seems to be the case that public servants' answers are being influenced by the underlying culture and values of their countries, not just the UK example, but of course on the other side of the coin, Nordic employers, for example, are renowned for promoting a high trust environment where employees are empowered to make decisions and take risks, and that seems to have been reflected in their positive responses too. That is where I will stop with the overview, but just to say that the full report is available on rgs.globalgovernment.com for you to read at your leisure, and we'll make sure it's shared in the report of this webinar as well. And there's a lot more interesting information in there for you to read beyond this whistle-stop summary that I have given today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Richard. There is so much going on there and so much to unpack. I know we're going to get into it throughout the webinar, but I'm just really curious for people in the audience. Some of you will be from countries that were included in the research. Some of you will be from other countries, but I think there will be something in there that all of you can relate to. So actually, before we go on to Alex to give us his reflections on the report, we have a poll for you because we're interested to know what you think as the audience. So the poll should have come up on your screens. Please don't be shy. Please engage with this poll. And our first question is, having heard from Richard how the survey was conducted and what the key drivers for a responsive organisation are, how do you feel today, sitting where you are? How do you feel in terms of how responsive overall you think your current department or your organisation is? And you choose one of those, tick one of those responses there, from not very responsive at all to very responsive. And I'm just going to remind you what the drivers were. So they are an environment for change, ability to move at pace, good leadership, good on teamwork and collaboration, empowerment and autonomy as a staff member, good use of evidence, tools and resources at your disposal, and willingness to consider new things and experiment. So they're the drivers. So in light of those, we'll just give you a couple of seconds to think about that. And if you could respond by ticking one of those, and we will in a moment bring up the responses so that you can see those straight away. While you're doing that, it's great to see we've got some questions coming in already. Susan, who's asked a question, do you want to expand on your question a little bit maybe? Because I'm not entirely sure what you mean. Here we go. Here are the answers to that poll already. So I think that kind of reflects. So we've got not very responsive is down at 1%. So thank you. We've got kind of half of our audience have engaged in the poll. Please, we're going to have a second poll at the end. Please do, all of you, engage in that final poll if you can. But 1% not very responsive, 19% or not responsive at all, 19% not very responsive, 8% not sure, don't know, 54% quite responsive, and 18% very responsive. So again, a positive overall in terms of quite responsive or very responsive, which I think matches the findings of the result. Thank you so much, Alexa. Alex, in light of those findings and based on what Richard said, I'm going to ask you to give us some thoughts.
Oh, thank you very much. And it's great to see you do the poll where, you know, so we're talking about predominantly over 3/4 of people on this webinar think that they're in a position to be able to respond. That's a fantastic place for them and their organisations to be. It'd be really great to understand behind that which organisations they're in, what countries they're in as well, see how that maps to the index. But thank you for inviting me to be here. For those who don't know me, I am Alex Richards, as advertised from PA Consulting. I have spent the past 23 years working in and with the public sector on large transformation and capability delivery initiatives. So it's great to be here again with Global Government Forum, discussing a topic that's important to governments and citizens around the world, but also one that's important to me personally. This is what I dedicate my my sort of full-time career to, at sort of today and over the past 7 years. So PA, we've been building the Adaptive Edge proposition organically through our experiences and engagement with major government departments over the past few years. And the Responsive Government Survey has provided a fantastic body of evidence that supports what we've asserted and documented in our 2020 Adaptive Edge report. More importantly, it's provided insights into civil servants' assessments of the level of preparedness to deal with today's ever-changing world. And for the first time, it has started to quantify that level. There's a lot in the survey, as Richard has just sort of taken us through and picked out some of the highlights. However, for me, it has overwhelmingly reflects that globally, civil servants don't believe that governments are truly in a position to be able to deal with the magnitude of challenge that's on the horizon. Civil servants done a fantastic job over the past 2 years addressing COVID, However, that has meant that they've had to break with tradition and cut through the bureaucracy to achieve the necessary outcomes. And if you work on the assumption that climate change, sustainability, and the increasingly volatile political landscape around the world are going to drive an even more fluid and uncertain strategic environment, governments need to embed what we call a permanent positive restlessness. This means transforming to organisations that are ready to continuously adapt and evolve. It means having the structures and culture to be able to change quickly. At the same time, organisations need a steady sense of who they are, what their purpose is, and how their strategy sets them up to achieve it. For this to be possible, adaptability has to be built into the fabric of organisations in government. Firstly, to embed a mindset of constant adaptability, transformation must be viewed as an ongoing imperative rather than a one-off event. While it's complex to replace established structures that are at the core of an organisation, it's essential to balance ongoing delivery with an ambition and the headroom for change. It's not just about having the right systems, processes, and people in place now, but anticipating whether they'll be right in 6 to 12 months' time and beyond. Capabilities need to be frequently assessed to understand the value they're adding to current priorities and to ensure capabilities are meeting future demand. Secondly, organisations must rewire their culture. This requires the leadership team and the workforce at all levels to adjust their values and behaviours. Empowering the workforce and allowing them to operate in dynamic and rewarding environments is essential. Everyone must be encouraged to discover, apply, and share learning from other organisations and sectors to help their departments evolve and operate as effectively as possible. Staff must be given the space to innovate regularly and encouraged to constructively challenge the status quo. Finally, this needs to be underpinned by creating a framework for flexibility. While radical change is required, it can't be at the expense of the advantages of the strong strategic centres and the long-standing requirement to comply with regulatory and legislative demands. Instead, organisations need a hybrid approach where the organisations can rely on the foundations that have stood them well over time while activating the benefits of empowered teams with the freedom to innovate. And this enables controlled delivery today whilst also having the flexibility to prepare for tomorrow. Now, departments must achieve another two objectives: accelerating insight-led decision-making and stepping up the pace delivery. Both of these are also highlighted and brought out in the survey. However, these will follow when departments have established a permanent positive restlessness. And this means removing the bureaucracy that respondents have reported as stopping them from being able to pivot to the challenges at hand. Now, in my experience, this isn't because there's a lack of ambition or drive, but it's because these are actually complex organisational-wide transformations that need to take place to enable the traditions and the bureaucracies that have been stood up for a much more stable environment to be undertaken. There are also few exemplars of what good looks like and also how to get there, because everybody is starting off on this journey at this point in time. The survey, however, has highlighted that things are starting to change, and I think the recent poll has supported that as well, where governments and civil servants are using their recent experiences to help this change. Final thing for me to say is that later this year, we at PA are going to be publishing our approach to unlocking the path to becoming adaptive as government organisations in our Adaptive Edge playbook. I believe that this journey for government departments is a team sport, so we'll be publishing this summary of our thinking from working with over 30 government departments in 9 different countries to help you and your organisations go on that journey.
Thanks so much, Alex. And I'm sure we'll keep our audience in touch with that publication in due time as it comes out. So really interesting to hear what you say there. I love that term that you use there right in the middle of your presentation, a permanent positive restlessness, and the idea that transformation is an ongoing kind of thing that has to be embedded into the culture of everything you do. And I think that goes back to something that struck me from Richard's presentation, which was the fact that a lot of civil servants think they are relatively good at planning in the long term and long-term strategies, but actually if they're not ready then for emergencies when they hit, how good has that long-term planning and strategy actually been. So a really interesting kind of thing to ponder there. Thank you so much, Alex. Again, loads to unpick there. I'm going to hand over to Paul. You've got lots of material there, I think, Paul, to bounce off in your words.
Thank you, Siobhan. Yeah, tons to talk about in very little time. So a lot of ground I want to cover. I'll try and do it fairly quickly, and hopefully in the Q&A we can start to unpack some of the things. But first of all, a huge thanks to Global Government Forum and PA for doing this survey. Certainly believe that the ability to benchmark and compare starts a very important conversation to see what best practices are out there and be able to assess yourself. So a huge thank you for starting this conversation and undertaking the study. A couple of things to share with everybody from a Canadian perspective. The first would be, in order to lock in, or as Alex said, create that sense of we need to do this, we have to acknowledge what we did well, what we didn't do well, what has been different over the last 2 years. There's been quite a few successes. There's been quite a few things that didn't go as well as we would have wanted. And I think that's where the conversation needs to start. And here in Canada, what we're trying to do at the federal level is lock in the lessons that have been positive. Not take them for granted, not determine or take for granted that they're going to be permanent and they're just going to stick. We have to acknowledge that it was exceptional times. And so what of those were 4 exceptional times, and we should leave them in our toolkit and only pull them out when it's required, versus those things that frankly should become more permanent. They are part of that culture that Alex talked about of continuous improvement, and they are not to be saved for when it's a crisis. And I think that there are definitely some lessons that we are learning in that respect. So I'll cover a number of them fairly quickly. The first would be authorities. We changed a lot of our authorities over the last few years, as Richard said, and that to create that sense of accountability and empowerment. And we realized that we removed quite a few controls that really literally added no value, and we're able to speed up. So we'll have to take a look at our authorities to say which one of those can stay. But there were a number of authorities that were quite exceptional because of the emergency nature. So we're going to have to sort through all of those policies to figure out which ones. And we've started to do that, and we've realized that there's quite a few authorities that we can leave. And they should be part of our permanent toolkit moving forward. The second obvious one, and we're using a little bit of it today, is digital and digital technology, and how that plays into governments being more responsive, and frankly, how it's changed civil society overall. And I'm going to unpack that quite a bit, but we definitely think digital, the use of digital and digital enablement is really important. Allows us to reach larger numbers of people more quickly, iterate to scale. So there's really the use of digital and how we think about digital has definitely started to shift. In the spirit of competition for talent, the other thing we've realized is the virtual workforce has been really empowering for us. We're able to now recruit in a way that we weren't before. A lot of our policies were place-based. And as we move to virtual, which is not worrying about place, we're able to expand our reach, have far more diverse and inclusive teams. And that's led to, we feel, some bursts and explosions in creativity and a different way of thinking. So that is good, but we are going to have to look at our policies because they tend to be place-based. And we're going to come to terms with this notion of hybrid, when we've all been working from home versus when we start to have some people who haven't enjoyed working from home because they've been unable to. Those are, I think, some of the issues we're going to have to think carefully about as we move forward. The other piece in that, certainly over the last 2 years, the pandemic for sure, but the pace of change, people's comfort with change, the impact on their mental health and their well-being is something we've realized has been extremely important to keep people engaged and feeling empowered as we move forward. Richard talked about it, and I want to underline it, that sense of pride. I think certainly in a pandemic, a global pandemic, the role of governments and the public service to respond to that challenge has created this sense of pride about the importance of the work that we do, the policies we deliver, the programs we deliver, And that has been absolutely fantastic. We've seen that right across the board. People feel that the work they're doing matters. And back to that virtual workforce, we've seen a greater interest in people joining the public service. We're never going to win on salary, but we can win on meaningful work. And we're starting to see some people say, you know what, I think I'd like to do some meaningful work. That is, in full transparency, becoming a little bit more difficult as the pandemic goes on and people's confidence in government starts to come into question as they start to receive different messages. But the understanding and the value that the public service provides certainly has shot up as it moves forward. So something else for us to consider. I think one of the most important things, and for me, it was a little counterintuitive at first, and then you kind of have that aha moment, is responsiveness is not about speed. And I think that that's one of the most important things I would encourage everybody to take away. And you don't have to agree with me, but I would just ask you to think about it. If we try and make every decision fast, that creates, I think, a little bit of recklessness. The real issue is, what is the risk? What is the rate at which decisions need to be made? If we try and keep this pace up, we will burn ourselves and our people out. Definitely, there are lots of decisions we feel we need and should be doing faster. But some things are measured twice, cut once, take the time. And if we create this sense that everything can be done too fast, I think we run the risk of being a little bit, I don't want to be too extremist here, but not everything needs to be done at this pace in perpetuity. And so I think what we need to be is what I would call risk smart. When is there an issue that we need to move fast, that the outcome matters and we really need to get it right and we need to be very responsive? Where there are other issues that are a little bit more, need to be handled in a bit more thoughtful way and don't need to go at the same pace. So I think one of the things that we're thinking quite a bit about is, what is the risk? Is the risk budgetary? Is the risk planning? Is the risk outcome? Is the risk impact? And adjusting our governance and the speed at which we expect to make decisions based on that risk. And I hope that we're able to pull that off. A couple things as Joanna, I start to wrap up would be back to digital. The ability to scale, I think, helps with responsiveness. You can create small sandboxes. You can experiment. You can iterate. That means you also need feedback mechanisms to be able to understand what really is working and is not working and adjust to those. And I think fundamentally, everybody says digital, digital, but it tends to be an afterthought or something they do at the end of a process. And we've realized the best experiences are when we bake it in right from the outset. We start thinking about how we're going to run the program, deliver the service, embedding digital right from the outset, not at the end and then seeing that. It's created new opportunities. It's allowed us to take a different set of risks. So bake it in right from the start. The other thing that I would suggest is the need to make sure, given this is a global government forum, the relationship between the political layer and the bureaucratic layer is one that needs to be rethought. When we're moving at this speed, we need a different kind of conversation between the bureaucracy and the politicians to build that trust and that confidence moving forward. We can't continue to govern by going in with, here's the budget, here's the timeline, we'll be back when it's done. How does that support and encourage iteration? It kind of sets us up for failure. And I think we've seen that firsthand through the pandemic, where it's been a lot more interactive and a significantly deeper understanding of the risks and trade-offs in going faster or slower and what that means. So there's, I think, an opportunity to rethink and redesign parts of that interface, particularly in a system like the one we have in Canada, Westminster. Final two thoughts. Innovation and responsiveness is not the sole domain of governments. And we've really understood, realized, and tapped in to the private sector, the academic sector, the social sector, And it is through partnerships that we have seen some of the greatest innovations. We've been able to do things that we didn't, frankly, think would have been possible in the timeframes we had to do with them. Industry stepped up, big business, but also small, medium-sized enterprises that are able to innovate, and how we bring them into our ecosystem, I think, is something that has been really, really important. But that partnership with civil society and with industry, and going to them with the problem, not with the solution we want to procure, I think is a different way of behaving, and changes the contractual relationships we need to be contemplating, and the incentives for everybody as they come to the table. And the final thing I would say, Siobhan, is in all of this, well, I agree with what Alex said, we have to make sure it's sustainable. That we are building these systems so that there is engagement, there is empowerment, and they're going to stick back to that. How do we lock in these lessons learned so that we can operate with that sense of continuous improvement, with that sense of being agile, but that we can sustain this pace. You know, we can't sprint a marathon. And there's times when we need to sprint, and there's times when we've got to realize this is going to take us a little bit longer and adjust our pace. And I think that putting all of those things together, that's the conversations we've been having. Certainly pleased with what we've been able to achieve and do here in Canada, but conversations like this, the ability to benchmark, share best practices, I think are what's going to be really, really important moving forward. And I guess the last thing, so I keep saying that, Siobhan, but in terms of some of the comments and questions about the views of senior leaders, and Richard, you talked about size. I think some of that is, you know, I can make a decision, but by the time it gets down to the tens of thousands of people who work for me, there's a bit of a lag there. And so I think that's part of, it's not just the population, but the size of the bureaucracy. And we've got to find ways to short circuit that so that those views start to align more quickly. I look forward to the Q&A, and I'll turn it back to you, Siobhan.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, that is such a wonderful kind of insight into how you're thinking about what you've learned from the COVID period, what can be kind of, as you say, taken forward to become part of business as usual going forward. But with all those caveats, I mean, what I really love about what you said there is how much you're thinking about the people elements of this. So yes, you're talking about kind of digital transformation and how you need to make sure that's kind of built in from the start of the policymaking process, but actually the amount of emphasis that you place there on making sure that we think about the kind of mental health and well-being impacts of this period, and how people have been working in a way that just isn't sustainable going forward. And I see we've got some questions coming in already, which I'll come back to, about kind of working practices going forward. But just even that you end there on that wonderful phrase, can't sprint a marathon. So we need to make sure that everything that we do going forward not only makes us more responsive as organizations, but is sustainable, and that people can sustain that as well going forward. So thank you so much. Such a wonderful insight into how you're thinking about things going forward from the shared services point of view in Canada. Greta, last but not least, and now you've had all of those wonderful presentations, from Norway's perspective, over to you.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. All the three Nordic countries that responded to this service, we have rated ourselves quite high on collaboration. I have worked with public services, specifically healthcare services around the world, and I find the Nordic countries very good in the collaboration. I'm not sure if that is only due to the size of the countries. We are quite small countries compared to the US and Canada, but I think it's also how we lead and how public sector leaders are. And I think it's a mindset about finding solutions together. So I will give you two examples, real life examples on how we collaborate. And these examples are from Norway. So in Norway, we have an integrated healthcare system. It's quite well integrated across local governments and hospitals. So it's not only social care going on in the local government, but it's a real healthcare provision in both local government and hospitals. So it's really important to work well and have integrated services there, but it's also difficult because incentives are different between hospitals and local governments, and cultures and structures are also very different. So to incentivize design and delivery of true patient-centric services, the Norwegian government has made various measures. And for those who are from US, etc., where you don't have so much public healthcare, 95% of the healthcare services are public, provided by public sector in Norway. So that's important background information. So the local governments and hospitals in Norway are incentivized financially to co-create services and deliver services in an integrated way together. And they have to work together to get money around the most vulnerable patient groups, like mentally ill patients, children in need for care, elderly people, and people with chronic diseases. And these groups spend most of the healthcare budgets in our country, so it's really important to make well-integrated services for these patient groups. So the government has established a program called InnoMed, and this is a program for collaboration, where we, in PA Consulting, we help the entire public healthcare sector to design and deliver patient-centric services for these patient groups. And this is not something done in the background, it's in the back room. It's representatives from all levels across the healthcare providers are working together with focus on co-creation and equality between the participating parties to create the services. And on the picture, we see a real-life example of one large hospital in southeast Norway, where the hospital works together with the local government and patients in the picture, creating new services for hospital at home. And exactly this service was very useful during COVID-19 because the primary care units and the hospital were able to collaborate around the infected patients, and they were able to discover much earlier if there was a need for hospitalization. So it saved lives. And it's much, you create the common culture and common understanding by working together, not talking about it. So I think besides financial incentives, we learned a lot in Norway about sitting together and create the services together is making a great, that's real stakeholder management, and that enables us to implement new services, digital services as well, at a quick pace. And if we turn to slide 2, I will show you another example of great collaboration and also experimentation. Actually, Norway scored very low on experimentation, but I think the Norwegian government is experimenting quite a lot, especially when it comes to digitization of public services. So in Norway, we had a very time-consuming process for sick pay. It was difficult for everyone to administer sick pay. For citizens, the health providers, social and benefit workers, and employers had to spend endless amount of hours to administer the sick pay, and there was many paper-based schemes involved. So NAV is the Norwegian Directorate for Social Benefits, Pensions and Sick Pay. It's the largest government organization in Norway. And a few years ago, they decided to start making a simple digital service, saving the entire society for manual work, and make it easier for the citizen to stay at home when sick and quickly return to work after recovery. So the directorate used the user-centric design as principle And there was a collaboration across 5 different directorates and ministries. So really 5 silos there. And we managed to make a fully digitized service, automating the entire sick pay service just in 6 months. Citizens and private companies, because the employers are a very important party here, participated in the work. And first there was launched a really simplified service. It was just electrified paper, but over 6 months it was automated, so you didn't need to do any manual case handling anymore. And this is saving. It's a huge time saving for citizens and employers and doctors and social workers in this service. And the core learning from this collaboration was that it requires experimentation and bold leaders. This service had a really strong leader who really stood up and dared to fail, and also dared to fix barriers and problems under the way. It didn't leave that to the program, but he took that in his hands. And this way of collaboration across government departments also requires an agile approach. Old school waterfall approach is very difficult. When you collaborate, you need common planning sessions, etc. So later, the Norwegian government has introduced agile as a recommended way of approaching collaboration, as well as there are clear recommendations of always involving the citizen when you create new services, and always use user-centric design when you are making new public services. So that was 2 examples from Norway.
Thanks so much, Greta. I think it's really good because we had the research, we've had the kind of overall picture, and then to get those case studies, I think you've really picked up on things that, you know, Paul mentioned, for example, the importance of partnerships across, not just across the public sector, but also public-private sector and the wider kind of public sector as well. And giving those real examples, you can see how that plays out in real life and see the huge benefits of having an approach like that. So thank you so much, there, for giving us those Norway examples. We have got lots of questions coming in, which is good to see. Before I go to the Q&A, I want to do, as I said, one final poll to see if anybody has changed or to build on that initial conversation. So the poll question now for you, and we have even more people on the line at the moment, is which of the following do you think are barriers to improved responsiveness in your organization? So having heard now all of those presentations, you can tick as many of these as you think apply to your organization. So are you struggling with, so are the challenges to responsiveness in your organization limited resources, unnecessary bureaucracy, lack of available skills, an inflexible organizational strategy, more risk-taking or experimental culture, so a lack of that, leadership and shared understanding of organizational purpose, limits to information sharing and collaboration, or available technology? Which of those do you think aren't as good as they should be, so they're barriers to improve responsiveness in your organization? We will give you a few seconds to answer that poll. Alexa, if you want to go in when you think you've got sort of a good response coming in, and then we will get the, okay, so in terms of the biggest barrier there, unnecessary bureaucracy, which I think matches what a lot of people have said in their presentation. I can see Paul nodding there, definitely. Limits to information sharing and collaboration, also a big barrier there, and an inflexible organizational strategy. So there isn't any of those which doesn't have anybody saying that, you know, doesn't have a single person saying they're a barrier, but I think that does match what we found in the research and what people have said in their presentation. So thank you so much, Alexa. We can take that poll off. Thank you to the audience for engaging in that. We will use that all in our follow-up to this conversation as well. So I just want to kick off our conversation actually with something I think you've all touched on, and the context for this conversation was around what's been learned during this pandemic process and has that kind of boosted civil services potential for dealing with crises going forward and for becoming more responsive. I just want to ask the very simple question, and Paul, I'm going to put this to you first. Despite all the thinking you've been doing on how you can embed those lessons learned, do you think there's a real risk for governments and civil servants around the world that as we slowly emerge from the pandemic, and as resources are going to be incredibly tight and people are thinking about rebuilding their economies, as their major priority, are we going to fall back on some of our bad practices? Do you think that's a real risk there?
Thanks, Siobhan. I think the short answer is yes, absolutely. That is the risk. And it's part of what we were talking about, the stickiness. How sticky are these changes? How permanent, how durable? Or will we see a tendency to drift back? Or in some cases, not even drift back, but snap back, that the command and controls that maybe were lifted are reimposed. And I think those are definite risks. So that's why I just would reiterate what I said. It's very, very important, I feel, for us to be taking a look at the lessons and figuring out what are the changes we made that need to be permanent, that need to be durable as we move forward. And acknowledge that the culture in a pandemic will be different than the culture we will need in as we return to normal. There was a sense of urgency, of common purpose and crisis here. That will shift as we come out of this global health emergency. And that comes back to then, how do we make this sustainable? How do we create that sense of engagement when there isn't a burning platform moving forward? I think there's opportunities and solutions to all of these issues. The key is not to take for granted that this is going to just be the operating stance moving forward. And I would suggest to you, it probably shouldn't be. There is a middle ground here that we need to find moving forward to make it sustainable, to make it better for employees, fiscally more responsible moving forward. We all know we can't keep these levels of spending. We're seeing it. So I do feel that we can't take it for granted, but we shouldn't want it to stay where it is, and we don't want it to go back to where it was.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Alex, I'm going to ask you the same question on the kind of backdrop of your experience of working with different organizations around the world. Do you see this danger, and is that partly why you are going to be producing this kind of good practice guide?
I think it's very much dependent on where in the world you are. I know, at the beginning of COVID, I guess going back 2 years ago, countries like Australia locked down hard on their international borders, and people were back in the office quite quickly after their lockdowns. And I believe I could be wrong on this, but I think that's going to have a big impact on the perspectives with the Australian
mid-thought there. I think we lost Alex for a moment. We'll come back to Alex in a moment, but I just want to, I'll move on to another. Oh, Alex, you're back in the room. Sorry.
I am. Yeah, it all went horribly wrong.
You were just telling us that the Australian perspective, for example, might be different.
Yeah. So within the APS, the Australian Public Service, they went back into the office really quite quickly because they had quite short lockdowns because they closed their international borders. I know in the UK and Europe, we've had some quite extended lockdowns, and everybody has had to work from home for extended periods. That has created a level of transformation in the ways of working that we, you talk to some of the director generals in government departments, and they're saying it would have taken them a decade to achieve what we had to achieve in 10 weeks just to keep services running and keep departments running. So I think there's something about where you are and the different countries' experiences that will have an impact on that. There is, I know in the UK, there's a real appetite to have, as Paul was talking about, that middle ground. So we have people back in the offices, but we also have the flexibility that comes with working from home. Just as one example, one of the program managers I'm working with at the moment is a civil servant. She's just going to get she's getting a new puppy at the weekend. So, the reality of being able to work from home for her is that it enables you to do those things that you wouldn't otherwise do. So I think it's getting that middle ground is really important, but it's a good place to be.
Which actually leads nicely. We had a question from somebody in Canada called Varden Ellsworth, who has asked, do you think your organisation, so I think this was probably for you, Paul, and it picked up on what you said in your presentation. So the extent to which you are planning to support the growing trend of staff working from home. So is this, I know you said you're thinking about this, is this the assumption now that more staff will be working from home, but on maybe different models? Some might be working entirely from home, some hybrid. So what's your kind of thinking on that?
So I think the first thing I would say is it is evolving. There is no doubt that working virtually, remote work has worked. We haven't seen a drop in productivity. So this is one of those things where we don't want to snap back. At the same time, we have had some people who continued to go into the office because that's the nature of their work. And so how do we avoid creating two classes of citizens or two classes of employees based on the nature of work? The third group to think carefully about is those that have been working from home but have not enjoyed the experience. You're seeing me, I have an office. I can, I'm away from the rest of my house, but if you have a small condo and you're working at the dining room table and your kids are homeschooling and your spouse is trying to work and you're talking over each other, it can be a very unpleasant experience. Or you live alone and you move to a new city for a new job. So we think that hybrid is going to be really important to be able to give people the choice. It will be job specific. We do think there are times when people do need to come together for attachment purposes, for team building. There is something lost when we are 100% virtual on these sorts of things. But ultimately, I think it comes down to what we heard earlier. We want engaged employees that are enabled and empowered. And I think part of this is how do you create the sense of an engagement? And in a digital world, give them the tools they need to be able to work remotely. And that becomes really, really important. And then I think you can put those three things together. You've got folks who are engaged, they have the tools they need to do, and they are empowered to make the decisions. And that could be coming to an office or working from home. It is the outcome that they're accountable for.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Paul. Greta, I'm going to come to you in a moment because we've got a question on Sweden, which I'm going to put to you. But Richard, there's a question specifically on the research from Mark, which it said, did you control for bias in the responses, in particular leaders' responses compared to kind of other responses? And is there a sense that leaders will be coming at it from a different perspective?
That wasn't done in a statistical sense in the report. What we tried to do to make sure that the validity of the results was include where possible the widest cohort of civil servants, so we could compare the leaders' views with those who are managers one rung down and perhaps those on the front line too. And that does pull out some distinctions in the report. In New Zealand, for example, there was possible leadership bias when comparing the leaders' scores to those of their more junior colleagues, whereas in the United States, interestingly, leaders were less optimistic about their organization's responsiveness than the managers and more frontline staff beneath them. So it was definitely something that we tried to explore by making the sample as wide as possible. And as I think we've already mentioned, this is a pilot study for us. We want to build the sample in the years ahead with as wide a data set as possible, and that will help us reinforce the robustness of the data.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Richard. So Greta, the question I want to put to you comes from Susan Fleming, and she has asked about Sweden, and obviously Sweden was put forward as the kind of most positive in terms of how responsive people thought their civil service was. And she's asked, do you think this could have anything to do with the fact that Sweden took a relatively moderate view of managing the pandemic? And so perhaps that moderate response was easier to adapt to and deliver on. So I guess you could broaden that question and say, do you think the nature of the response led to a different thinking from the civil servants about how responsive their governments were?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I think first of all, actually, we in PA Consulting thought Sweden scored themselves very, very high in this survey. Maybe surprisingly high, to put it diplomatically. I think when I look into leadership, teamwork, and empowerment autonomy, I recognize this across the Nordic countries. Is the type of it's a recognizable type of leadership style and type of working. Sweden distinguished themselves from Denmark and Norway because it's more a leader cannot just decide anything in Sweden. A leader in Sweden would be more inclusive in making decisions and make sure everyone agrees. And that hinders a little bit ability to move at pace. And they not score themselves so high on ability to move at pace. When it comes to the pandemic, I think Sweden chose a different strategy. Not so much closed down of the lockdown in the society, and but maybe it was a wise strategy. It was different compared to the rest of the world and rest of the Nordics. It enabled them to keep the government and businesses open, and as a fact, they didn't have as big a change as we had in Denmark and Norway and Iceland and Finland. They could stay in their offices and keep on working very much the same way for a long, long time. So it could be some correlation there, yes.
Thanks, Greta. And Paul, is that something that you think in Canada as well? You said, so obviously there was this surge of kind of pride and trust in the public sector in the initial response to the pandemic, but you're saying over time there's a bit of fatigue. So maybe as well as those, restrictions have to stay in place, the response is still there. Is that also going to affect the way civil servants think about how responsive their government have been? Do you think if we took the survey in maybe 3 months' time, 6 months' time, you would have got a different response?
I think we'll have to wait and see when you repeat the survey, because there's a lot of factors at play there. I think the understanding and the importance of government programs, policies, because of the pandemic is definitely something that is sticky. I think that will be permanent. That's a piece of education that people have understood. I think the issue around pride comes to the confidence in government. And as messages change and as we see different jurisdictions take different approaches, people naturally will wonder, well, is the approach in my jurisdiction right or wrong? And then public servants naturally, as they are loyally implementing those policy choices, may start to wonder. So I think given where we are in the pandemic, different countries at different paces, different approaches, I think we will start to see some variation.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. We've got a really good question here, I think, coming from Paul Joyce, who said it would be interesting to consider this responsiveness context in the light of the kind of 2030 agenda. So looking at kind of how well governments and civil services are placed to meet their climate goals, for example. And in light of that context, do you at the panel think that the top scorers in this survey would also be the top scorers if we looked at those kind of issues, those kind of big challenges facing countries? And in particular, would those kind of Northern European countries, do you think, would still be as well placed? Alex, any thoughts on this from your kind of experience globally?
Yeah, so I think this is a really difficult one. And why do I say that? Addressing climate change is a long-term investment. There's a lot in that. There's a lot of implications for government, for industry, for international relationships and politics in it. I think it's going back to Paul was talking about earlier on. He was talking about sometimes it's not about speed, it's about making risk smart decisions. For me, this is all about actually making high quality decisions and matching the type of decision making process with the type of nature of problem you're dealing with. I don't see necessarily climate change as being something that requires tempo. It's about repointing the oil tanker. Responses to climate change, if we don't do anything about it, that's going to require responsiveness and tempo and people being able to pivot.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Alex. Paul, do you think, though, that some of those lessons learned from how people have responded to the pandemic, so better collaboration, putting the citizen first, better partnerships with the private sector, aren't they all going to be useful as well in dealing with kind of some of these other big medium to longer term challenges, as well as these immediate kind of emergencies?
Absolutely, couldn't agree more, John, with what you said. I think the research is pretty clear. Multidisciplinary, inclusive teams lead to better results. So the more we can tap into that kind of approach for these, as Alex said, very difficult, very long-term, important policy issues, we're going to benefit from that approach, that different way of thinking. Collaborative research is where I think we'll start to see some of the breakthroughs. But this other area, as Greta was saying, is the ability to take risk. And I do think climate change is one of those things where we need to change the curve. It's not, we're going to have to make some pretty radical shifts if we're going to meet those targets. That means we're going to have to encourage some experimentation. And so as Alex said, these are big bets. So it's important for us to experiment safely and quickly to understand what is working, to then scale it up and to turn off what is not working. And so I think it's not necessarily the speed of decision making we went through the pandemic, but that sense of encouraging failure. Because one of the things about encouraging failure is raising the level of ambition. I talk to my folks, if you're not failing, you're not trying hard enough. So try a little bit harder and let's learn from those failures. The key though, on smart risk taking and on making mistakes, as Greta was saying, is acknowledging them quickly and not rationalizing them away or believing you can fix them, but acknowledging it was a mistake, understanding how that changes your hypothesis and adapting. And if we do that, we'll make good use of the time. If we don't, I worry we'll run out the clock. So that would be my response.
Thanks, Paul. Greta, I can't not put a question about Northern Europe to you as well. So have you got anything to add there on this? If you're good at kind of responsiveness, do you think you're also going to be good at meeting these big policy challenges?
I'd hope so, but I'm from one of the countries that produce most oil in the world. So I think my own country likes to point to others where we should, but we've done some really effective measures in Norway, for example, incentivizing citizens to buy electric cars by actually putting more taxes on traditional cars running on fossils and making it cheaper to buy and drive an electric car. But we have to look into the farming industry and we have to look into the oil industry, and there is a lot of work to do. And I think no country can do this together because in the European Union and European countries, we share an energy market. And we really had to look into how we consume and produce energy together and find solutions together. So the new challenge is not only collaboration within a country across our own ministries and departments. The super big challenge going forward is how we can make Glasgow a really a workshop where we take decisions, go home and fix things. And right now, I think we are not willing to sacrifice enough and take effective decisions at an international level.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned COP26 there. I think one of the things we've learned from the pandemic is when there are global issues, whether it's the pandemic or climate change, we could do better at working together. And I think that's one thing that we've learned from kind of this period, definitely. We have another great question that's come in here from Joshua High, who has said that defence organisations and the military often have to confront rapidly changing operational environments. And how often do government departments consult with military colleagues and vice versa to share knowledge and identify lessons? I think this is a really good question, because I think, PA, I think you probably work with military organisations. You obviously can't tell us too much, but do you think there is enough kind of sharing of lessons there? And are those departments some of the best placed to do this responsiveness best practice? Alex, your thoughts?
So I think there's a lot. So I work in our defence and security go-to-market team. So I spend most of my time working with defence and law enforcement organisations. I think there is a lot that can be learnt from their operational environments. They, you know, as Josh has highlighted here, they are exceptionally good at running high tempo operations in very high risk and sort of theatre environments. I think the one thing to observe is that when you start looking at the sort of defence headquarters, doesn't matter which country you're working in, they have a different culture to the operational, you know, the frontline commands operational parts of the business. So I think it is true what Joshua says, but there's also that needs to be balanced by the fact that actually defence does have its own bureaucracy. It's got its own ways of operating that we need to learn from as well. So there's something I was going to say that has literally just fallen out of my mind. So what I was going to say was defence, I think, is also going through this the same journey for themselves, because actually, how do they become more responsive? How can they adapt? They are traditionally, defence is used to working from large platforms. You know, they buy units of kit that have a 30-40 year lifespan to them. They are starting to realise that actually that is quite a long time period, and the level of uncertainty that we have in the world means that they need to be thinking in shorter time periods than that. So when you start looking at their investment life cycles and the fact that a lot more things are going digital, and you know, if you're working in the digital world, you are developing new capability on a daily, you know, weekly and daily basis. How do you reconcile a 30-year investment period with developing new capability in days and weeks? The way that business cases, finance, treasury all work make that a challenge in its own right.
Thanks. Paul, do you, from shared services perspective, do you work with defence and military organisations, and do you think, as Alex says, that they're good in some of this but also have their own challenges in other ways?
So the short answer is yes. We do work with them very, very closely, and I think Alex provided a very full answer there. They have their definite strengths, and there's some challenges, as we all have. I think two things that I would say about this, maybe not specific to defense, but taking the question back a bit, is I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be very open-minded about where these best practices might come from. Is it, as Greta was saying, in healthcare? Is it, as this question, in defense? We are all being pressured and stressed to change and adapt. And I think we can all learn, what's part of what I liked about this study, from other jurisdictions, other approaches, to figure out what has worked, why it has worked, and then determine how that will apply to my operating environment. And I think the more we can really embrace the notion of continuous improvement and best practice and be open to wherever it may come from, I think that goes back to that collaborative approach. Siobhan, I know we're kind of tight on time, but the other thing that I think with the last question we didn't cover in our answers is, while the collaboration is important, there is a governance question here. And how does the bureaucracy interact with the political oversight? If you think about Westminster systems, tend to be very vertical, whereas the collaboration tends to be very horizontal. And I think there is some work we have to do around governance and governance institutions to make sure that we're thinking about how those two things work together. The typical governance we have doesn't really, I think, react at the speed and pace that we need for the kind of collaboration moving forward.
Yeah, I'm really interested. I think that links to what Greta said about where the money flows as well. And actually, you can use that flow of money to force collaboration as well. So our final question, then, I'm going to combine two things that we've got coming in. Robert Riddle has asked something about kind of culture and changing culture, and so has Zaman. So they're both asking about how you can change culture to kind of shift the mindset to constant adaptability, and also to empower people to really be able to take risks and think it's okay to be taking risks. So I think just your quick reflections on, I think people don't disagree with the aspiration, but how do we actually change culture in reality? Greta, I'm going to come to you because obviously Norway, they've been doing a lot of this experimentation. So I'm afraid we are running out of time. So very quick thoughts on this cultural shift.
Yeah, it's I think you need to empower people and step back a little bit as leader. A good leader, in my view, in, for example, now with the sick pay service, is a leader that helps removing barriers, and he's not detail managing the program or the services. I just give an example. The steering group of this project was the top management group of the biggest government directorate in Norway. They were working in the user labs, observing how the citizens reacted to the new sick pay service. They didn't sit around the table looking in status reports. I think that is responsive way of leading, and I think we need to change how we lead. It starts on the top.
Yeah, thanks, Greta. Paul, your thoughts on this?
I think Greta said it beautifully. I think as senior leaders, we need to mean what we say what we mean. And if we're serious about this, we need to model it. We need to create the environments that encourage it and celebrate it. And that's what's going to be really important. I think the risk is, if it is just words, people will see that very quickly. They will see through it, and that's where you risk that snapback, that sense of disempowerment. If you want people to take risks, you need to support them when they take risks. You need to celebrate their successes and their failures and what we learn from those moving forward. So I think it is really, truly about creating the environment that aligns with everything we've been talking about and making it real. If we don't, people will see through that.
Thanks, Paul. Alex, anything to add on that?
So completely echo what Paul and Greta have said. To quote, is it Peter Drucker, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So if you can have the finest plans, the finest strategy, but if you don't address the cultural aspects head on and do that well, it's always going to fail or be suboptimal. So understanding people who are in the teams, people who are working for the civil service, what drives them, what their needs and wants are as well. Everybody's got their own aspirations, so being able to understand that and shape it and work with it to drive the right behaviours and make sure that people are feeling rewarded is absolutely crucial.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. Just before we wrap up, I just want to say to the audience, thank you so much for your brilliant questions. If we didn't manage to get through, you sent in so many, we will make sure they get answered after this event. But a survey has just gone out. It will be in your inbox. Please do take a couple of minutes just to complete that for us. It means that we make sure we give you exactly the type of events that are most useful for you. So hugely grateful if you could do that straight after the event. Our very, very last thoughts from the panel, and actually I'm going to wrap this up with saying that a couple of people have asked about what next. So one person has said, do they think the timing of the survey affected the results? Kind of touched on that already. but that's also linked to a question where somebody has said is how often these types of surveys going to be done. Richard, maybe I could throw that your way just to give people a sense of next steps.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be, excuse me, going to be an annual survey over the next 3 years. Sorry, the next 2 years. It was a 3-year project. So we're looking very much to, I think we've already mentioned, expand the survey, increase the number of participants, both numerically and geographically. So we're very keen to do that. I think timing is a very interesting question, because we've heard in the session today that, you know, we're at the stage where we're coming out, but not quite clear of the immediate COVID response. It's about trying to learn the lessons from what was a massive crisis and what we can adapt, what can be embedded into kind of more systemic policies in the future. So yes, the first survey was a snapshot of a moment in time of when people were dealing with that crisis and maybe trying to think a little bit more long term. The next one will probably begin to look at to what degree that has been successful, and I think it is a very interesting time to be looking at that and trying to learn those lessons and see if it is changing responsiveness kind of across the board.
Thanks, Richard. Alex, and then Greta, what would you like to see going forward? What do you think the future holds?
So I think, as Richard just said, understanding the direction of travel. Hopefully, I'd like to see that departments have really learned from what's been happening over the past 2 years and starting to embed that. I can see some of the challenges around actually how you create the headroom to this. I know there's a question from Robert Riddle around actually the how. That is actually really, really difficult, really challenging. So being able to share thinking, learn the lessons from around the world about how people have successfully done that, start to get that empirical evidence together. For me, that's absolutely critical to understanding how to unlock this.
Thanks, Alex. Greta, did you want to add anything to that?
So I experienced a fantastic responsiveness in the healthcare sector during the pandemic. And this is not only in Norway, but all over the world. And I hope this will be the future, that we continue responding in a fast pace like this, because we have, within healthcare, we have so many things in the Western world to solve. We have an elderly population and there are great problems. And if we are so much responsive as we have been the recent 2 years, I think we can manage everything. So I just hope we use the rocket speed we have now, but we also have to take care of employees, like Paul said, to make sure people don't get burned out.
Thanks, Greta. And Paul, I know we've got lots of Canadians in the audience, but not but for civil servants around the world. I'm going to give you the final kind of comments on this. So if we do repeat this survey in a year's time, what would you like to see?
Well, I think what I would like to see is that collectively we understand that our employees are our greatest resource, that the innovation we've been talking about, that the responsiveness comes from people, and that is one of the lessons that does stick, that we understand that we can respond, but it requires us, as everybody has said here today, to make sure our employees are engaged, they're enabled, they're empowered, and then we have ways to learn those lessons with them to be accountable. And when we can figure out how to do that consistently, repeatedly, I think we will succeed.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's a perfect sentence to finish on. I love that. Responsiveness comes from people. So it just leaves me to say a huge thank you to our panel, to Richard, to Paul, to Alex, and to Greta. Thank you so much. To the audience, thank you for your great questions. You will all be sent a link with a video of this webinar, so you can watch it all again, or you can share it with your colleagues if some of them weren't able to view it today. And you will also get a write-up of this in a week or so with all the key points from the conversation. Of course, don't forget to take a good look at the survey and the research findings if you haven't already done so. So wherever you are, enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope we see you at another one of our webinars very soon. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye for now. Thanks.